Welcome to the Research Reimagined podcast, brought to you by Nottingham Trent University. I'm your host, Helen Darby-Dowman, and I'll be inviting some of NTU's brightest minds to explore how their research is helping us to deepen our understanding of the world. From online addictions to transgender rights and sleep disorders. Listen as we discuss some of society's most pressing challenges and uncover some of the ways our research is making a difference. For politicians, speaking to voters is an important part of democracy. Political parties spend a lot of time researching public values and opinions in order to craft statements that will resonate with their voters and challenge non-voters to consider a different point of view. Effective marketing can go a long way towards the success of a political campaign. By saying the right things and positioning arguments in a certain way, politicians can create a brand image that can influence public perceptions and ultimately win votes. I'm joined today by two NTU researchers, Dr. Colin Alexander, Senior Lecturer in Political Communications, and Dr. Pich, Senior Lecturer in Nottingham Business School, to discuss the role of marketing in politics and whether it has the power to sway public opinion here in Britain. So thanks both of you for joining us. Colin, can you talk to me a bit about your background? Tell us about your research area as well.
So I joined NTU in September 2013, and my interest is really in, as you say, political communications, but particularly looking at things like propaganda and the role of propaganda in modern society. And I think that perhaps people have an inclination that propaganda is something that happens externally from their political world. But my public role is to try and encourage people to think more clearly about propaganda in their immediate lives and the role that manipulation strategies by the powerful play in trying to get them to think about certain things and think in certain ways about certain things.
Chris, can you talk to me a bit about, again, your area of work and your background?
Yeah, so I joined in July 2010, so just over 10 years now. And 2012. And my kind of research background is political branding and political marketing. So basically the application of marketing concepts, theories and frameworks to politics. So a lot of overlap with Colin's work. But I've always been fascinated how political parties, candidates, campaigns can all be seen as brands and often use, like I say, marketing and branding strategies and tactics in order to try and position themselves and communicate and engage voters. And that's something that I've kind of worked on for many years, like I say, from 2012 onwards. And I've been looking at this from different contexts and settings as well. So not only from the kind of traditional UK perspective and parliamentary systems, but also settings like Iceland, India, you name it, many different contexts and settings, which obviously then it makes us question the application of concepts and theories to politics.
So how does marketing actually fit into politics? And how does marketing affect how people feel about politics, especially here in the UK?
To come back on what Chris said there, I think Chris looks at this in more of a kind of practical sense of this is how to do this. This is how to engage and this is how to communicate. And where my research comes in is to say, well, should this be the case? And indeed, what is perhaps the fallout from it? So your question about like what actually happens here? Well, one of the problems with political branding and political marketing is that I think it changes the way in which voters or potential voters actually engage with politics. What you end up with is rather than a politician trying to appeal to voters, there's a sense of falsehood which begins to emerge because the brand it's too linear perhaps, and the person doesn't necessarily come across as a full human being. They come across as a sort of branded concept. And so if you think about a basic human being, we have skills, we have attributes, we also have prejudices, and we also have flaws. And what the branding is trying to do is to eradicate any sense of anybody saying anything controversial, for example, or indeed doing something which might not appeal to the mainstream. So what you find with branding is that they are trying to appeal to everybody and yet nobody at the same time. And this can sometimes create a sense of political apathy within the voters.
Yeah, I think that's the juxtaposition really, that branding is all kind of always been designed to try and allow products, services and people to kind of stand out against their competitors. But the more that, like I say, you think about it and they're kind of using these concepts, theories and frameworks, they're all kind of following the same rule book. So in a way, they're starting to, they're not differentiating themselves at all. They in a way, start to look exactly like their competitor. So in a way, it is that kind of juxtaposition that, yeah, we're applying branding, but then it can confuse voters. But some recent research I've been doing in Jersey, for example, many disengaged voters out there are kind of crying out for more clearer communication, clearer kind of ideas of what their politicians stand for. So they look towards branding and marketing communications as a way to try and hopefully improve and strengthen their engagement in future elections. Whether that will, if that actually happens, it'll be great. But that's what they're kind of calling out for. So it's interesting, and like I say, if it can be used, or is it going to alienate? Like Colin said,
it's interesting because when you have a politician who then thinks, well, okay, I need to communicate better, inverted commas, better, they think, well, I'm now going to turn to these kind of corporate communications professionals who are going to market me and brand me better, when actually what they need to do is just be more authentic and take away those layers of bureaucracy around their communication. But then, of course, that comes with risks, and particularly the various sort of party hierarchies, which may feel as though that's not appropriate for them. So you have, I guess, the concept of the whip within parties, where everybody is meant to be, at least for the most part, on point about certain issues, even if they personally agree with them or not. But what that really leads to is this kind of frustration with the voters, with politics, and also just more generally, it takes us into a broader philosophical question about the role of truth and falsehood in society and the acceptability of that. And that's something which I think has moved quite a bit with the digital age, because we have all become propagandists now. You go on your Facebook, you go on your Instagram, you go on your Twitter accounts, and you're essentially saying something which is usually a half-truth or an extenuation of the truth. You're not necessarily saying a falsehood. But what I think has happened with some of what my research looks at is the extent to which we accept propaganda, we accept manipulation by others because we're doing it ourselves. So it's no longer a kind of an us and them playing field, if you like.
So are we sort of saying there's not really, what's the difference then between this political marketing and propaganda? Are we saying that there isn't much?
Well, from my perspective, I have argued many times that words like advertising, branding, marketing, public relations, you can keep going with this stuff, right? They're all words that emerge in the mid-1900s, the sort of mid-20th century, as alternative words to propaganda, used because propaganda becomes tainted with negative connotations, particularly after the Second World War and the use of it extensively by the Nazis in order to corrupt the German public into believing that, well, I think we all know this story, that certain things were acceptable, which really we would say are morally bankrupt, if you like.
I would agree. And, you just have to look back at the kind of history of not only marketing and branding. For years, politicians have always used these different tactics, these different strategies, but they don't necessarily always like to use the word marketing or branding. They see it as a dirty word, or as if it's some dark arts. But you go back to the 1900s, they were all using different tactics, like putting kind of pictures of themselves in cigarette packets, posters, public speaking. They're just different forms or different tactics of marketing and communication. So I think what's happened over the last, say, 20, 30, 40 years, it's that sophistication, that specialism, and we're all using these terms now, marketing, communications or branding, and it's become much more, like I say, polished or professional, as it were, or consistent.
And I guess also there's so many more avenues of getting that information out there that didn't exist many years ago.
Oh gosh, you just have to look at kind of the rise of social media and how kind of that's kind of been used by political parties, candidates, campaign groups, lobby groups. You name it, they all use these different online and offline tactics to try and engage voters and try and put their message across, basically, if you boil down, it's all about trying to persuade the voter that their cause or their message is the one to follow or adopt.
And is there anything in the use of those different platforms to the authenticity of the message that's coming out? Like, when you look at something like social media, and Colin, you mentioned the fact that we've all become propagandists, then is there something because of social media that we can do that ourselves? Is it looked at within the sense of, if it's traditional branding, different to if it was social media? Is there any contrast in how we look at it?
I think there's a few things to say there. I think that the first thing is that the communications professional will always use the technology that's available to them at the time. So if you go back to the 1920s and this kind of birth of radio broadcasting, politicians, corporations are keen to advance their brand, for use of a better word, on that platform. Same with television, same with the digital age, same with newspapers, go back a few hundred years. So it would be futile of a professional communicator to decide that they were going to be prejudiced against one platform or another. The most important thing is to go to where your audience is. And right now your audience is predominantly spending their leisure time or their time not being productive or not at work on social media. So you obviously navigate to there. But the secondary part of that question concerns how different media interact with our cognitive functions, I guess. There's a lot of evidence that screen-based media, we are more passive when we are engaged in screen-based media. So there's a lot more opportunity for subliminal messaging to emerge. So background images, for example, music that can occur. If you're reading something, you tend to be relatively critically engaged in actually reading what that thing is. Equally, if you're listening to the radio, you can be a bit more tuned in, for use of a better word, to it. However, what we see, particularly with the advent of television in the 50s and the 60s, and then through to the digital age, is much more opportunity for the propagandist to propagate certain messages that are both conscious and subconscious.
And what we've also seen is, obviously with the rise of social media, we've done some research with young people, and they were very much kind of becoming co-creators of that shared content. So they not only were necessarily commenting on posts from parties or candidates or political groups, but they were often tailoring and creating their own posts. We often call debranding, trying to kind of take on a different narrative, a different message to counteract that kind of party or brand or politician. So there's a lot more we're seeing a lot more involvement from citizens now, because obviously they've got the tools at their disposal, as Colin was saying, so they can get involved. And it's interesting that sometimes it can get really heated, as you've probably seen on Twitter, on Facebook, and all these social media platforms. But it's sometimes seen as a good thing, because at least they're getting involved. They're sharing their kind of concerns, and I think it's a good thing for society.
Yeah, I mean, you do see that with one of the great diversifiers of social media is the two-wayness of the communication that can occur. Most of the time, whether it's a newspaper, radio, television, it's a one-to-many communication. However, with social media, you have this ability for feedback, and quite strong feedback, as you say, to emerge. And this is why political parties, and indeed particular candidates, often employ people to do what's called community management, which is essentially about trying to prevent particular negative messages from gaining traction upon social media. So a well-followed politician on social media may well have 100,000, 200,000 followers in this country, many more perhaps in other countries. And if they tweet something, they post something, you got to expect that perhaps a third of the comments that come back to them are going to be in some way mocking, negative, satirical, nasty, xenophobic of some sort of kind. And clearly you don't want your message to be diluted by that interaction.
Can you remember the 2010 general election with Ed Miliband and his kind of tombstone kind of pledge to have 10 kind of pledges that he would kind of enact if he was in Downing Street on a tablet of stone? And obviously that was then posted on social media, but then everyone kind of got involved creating different pictures, different images. So we had kind of images of kind of biblical kind of references and comedy references as well, and it just went viral. And it kind of lost the message, and I think in the end, Labour and Ed Miliband had to kind of destroy that kind of tablet somewhere. It was never seen ever again because they thought it was like a tombstone, or it was kind of not the correct symbol, that they...
It was interesting that, because the communication strategist behind Miliband's decision to do that, because it wasn't Ed Miliband that thought that one up, was ultimately to, as you say, create a sort of 10 Commandments, Ark of the Covenant-esque type document, and to sort of really, ultimately to try and attract the sort of middle-class, church-going, religious aspect who usually vote Conservative. So it was an appeal to voters who may well be disillusioned with the Conservative Party, and it completely backfires on them. Isn't it? In the same way that when, from a non-political point of view, when anybody puts something out to a public vote, so for example, what's the name of the new ship that's going to go to the Antarctic, and everybody said sort of Boaty McBoatface, or Justin Bieber asked people where should he play his next concert, and the winning vote was Pyongyang.
In terms of looking at those that are actually putting this content out there, so, does it mean that we should be, or should people be concerned about the intent of those that are doing political branding in the industry?
I think, no, I wouldn't say no. No, I'd say no, because obviously it's all to do with what is the message, what is the kind of the communication, what is the goal? Is it to persuade and just get your kind of key message across? If it's obviously becoming distorted, or there's falsehoods, or the message is misleading, that's when we should question and we should be concerned. But I think, political parties and candidates have used these tactics for years, like we've said. It's just now it's become out of control in a way, in a sense, because, like I say, more people have control of those different tactics that can be used. Yeah,
I think that branding is used across a multitude of industries and societies, so it would be naive to say that politics should sort of ring fence itself and say, well, we're not going to do that. As Chris says, the important thing is to look at the intent of the communicator. If the intent of the communicator is to deceive, then we have a problem. If the intent of the communicator is to, roughly speaking, tell a truth, even if that is a perhaps selective and self-interested truth, at least there still is an element of truth to be discussed there. But when the intent of the communicator is to deceive, then we move towards a nadir of politics.
And we hear about political disengagement. I mean, what is it?
Well, it comes in different forms. So somebody could be just not necessarily engaged emotionally, but that they're still involved rationally, or they could be kind of there emotionally but not rationally, and that could have an impact on behaviour. So I think it's quite a complex area to being disengaged. I remember recently speaking going back to Jersey, some voters in Jersey, and they were really disenchanted and disenfranchised with politics in Jersey, but they said it was their civic duty to always vote, and they would vote till the day they die. But they were uncomfortable with the situation, and they would often describe themselves, I would describe myself as disenchanted or disengaged. So I think it is a complex term. I think the ones we have to kind of focus on are the ones that either don't vote or have stopped voting, and try and understand why that's the case, because then obviously we can try and create strategies and tactics to try and encourage them to vote in the future.
I mean, how important is it for politicians and their parties to be engaged with the public? And I know particularly there's a lot of conversation around the younger generations as well.
Yeah, I mean, there always is that young person question. I think one of the important things to say here is that it's only kind of strange people like Chris and I who sort of study politics, if you like, or who are interested in politics. For the most part, people become interested in politics through one or two particular issues that become relevant to their lives. So whether it's crime or gender equality issues, housing issues, take whatever it is that you wish there, environmental issues perhaps as well. So people become interested through issues and then move forward with that and then gain that sort of traction that way. I would say that political apathy extends further than just voting. This is people who just sort of generally don't utilise that sense of citizenship that we would argue that they ought to. But it's not necessarily their fault, so to speak. There's a lot of psychological factors in this. I mean, self-esteem is a particular one. So this is one of the reasons that people from working class backgrounds tend to vote less than people from middle or more affluent backgrounds, is that sense of, will my vote make a difference? Will I actually be able to achieve something in voting? And also, perhaps intentionally, politicians are quite keen sometimes to make politics seem quite complicated. And that, I believe, is part of the propaganda mechanism here, in that they don't actually enfranchise people through, for example, the school system with political literacy. And therefore, it just all looks confusing, so I'm just not going to bother.
And that's what research tells us. They say that young people and these people who are, like you say, classed as disengaged, they want to know more, but they're put off by the language, the terminology used. They feel it's not for them, or like you say,
somebody's told them it's not for them through generational family generations not voting, and therefore they're told a repetitive message.
And in a recent focus group I conducted not long ago, it was interesting. At the end of the focus group, this lady had said to me, this young lady had said that she'd never voted, she had no interest in politics, but at the end of the focus group, she said, do you know what, I really feel that I want to get involved, and you've inspired me now, because I feel that, politics is relevant, and these political issues are relevant to me, but what I want to do is, I want the language to be, to resonate with me and clearer, and if that was the case, hopefully I will then get involved in future elections and, become a civic, take part in civic duty.
On that note, what should political parties be doing to engage voters ahead of the next general elections?
I think they need to spend time trying to understand why so many people are seen as disengaged or don't get involved, and then they can try and build kind of strategies and tactics around that. And it would probably still come back to the points that we've said before about the limited education or that perception that politics isn't for them. But I think just making sure that politics is made relevant and it resonates, and politicians and political parties are authentic, as you said before, as Colin said before. So I think just being simple, but also not coming across as following the rule book too much, in the sense you come across as fake, or you come across as inauthentic, or so it's a fine balance, really, isn't it, if you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, and there's also a wider issue around the education system, and you can see differentiation between England and Scotland here, where in Scotland in high schools you have a subject called modern studies, which is essentially about political education, and many a sociologist or political sociologist has done so, for example, focus groups, and they found that usually Scottish people have more political knowledge than English people, and are able to actually sort of wade through the propaganda of politics in a bit more of a critical fashion than the average English voter. Now, this is not to say that plenty of people in England have lots and lots of political education and can see it for what it is. However, I think the point here is that you don't have a similar subject in English schools. And the question then becomes, well, why don't you have a subject in English schools? And I would argue it's on account of particularly Conservative Party policy, which would rather not have that level of political education, because that level of political education, particularly in the hands of the working classes, is less likely to elect a Conservative government. So you have some really quite underhand tactics here of ensuring that the public remain placid, for example.
And it's interesting, actually, because the government in Jersey are actually trying to do this at the moment, trying to roll out some sort of independent education programme, but not only for young voters, but also people who are just moving to the island, and trying to get people involved that way and engaged that way. Other people who have become disengaged have another education platform for them. So I think Jersey's, setting the really good kind of precedence, and I agree with Colin in saying that in the England, for example, they don't have to have that kind of consistent kind of curriculum across the country, where it wouldn't take much to kind of roll that out, like an independent system that would hopefully kind of educate and try and engage young voters and hopefully then long-term voters.
It's actually an interesting question, isn't it? Like, if you're afraid of the voters, if you're afraid of the masses, then the simple question is, why are you afraid of the masses? It's likely because you're duplicitous or you're inauthentic in some way in what you're saying, and you're worried about being held to account for it.
And whenever you speak to voters, and these are people who've never voted or they're a bit disengaged, they always say politics doesn't have an impact on my life. They can't see that relevance. So making that kind of argument at an early stage would hopefully, like I say, then hopefully make sure that they become long-term engaged voters and then exercise their democratic right.
I mean, the example I give with my students is to say that, I'm of an age, I think we're all of an age, that university was free when we went to university, and or at least it was taxpayer funded, whereas now students pay over £9,000 a year, and they are leaving university with sizably more debts than we left university in comparison to inflation. And so is that not something to become politicised over and say, actually, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, the first £9,000 a year students only came in 2012. And one of the problems you have, particularly with young voters, is that 2012 for them was when they were it's still in kind of infancy. Our students that have come to us this year were born in sort of 2004. So they're only sort of 7 years old when this happened. So that sense of perspective, or particularly historical perspective, is lacking in them. Whereas for us, we think, well, that's just, not so long ago. But it really, really wasn't, and has a profound effect on their lives. And that's a profoundly political decision that was made.
I think it also comes back to the actual wording around it. So again, going back to focus groups, when I asked young voters, okay, what political issue is important to you? You'd often get kind of a puzzled look, or not always kind of get a clear answer. But as soon as you take the word politics out, what issues are important to you? Sustainability, education, jobs. And then obviously you have about an hour's or 2 hours kind of focus group discussion. And then at the end of it, people would say, hang on, I am interested in politics. I didn't realise that. Yeah. So it's the language that we use to try and engage.
Yeah, I mean, a very simple question is, what issues are occurring in your life at the moment, right? And you go, well, I'm struggling for student accommodation. Okay, that's a political issue.
Yeah.
I've got mental health concerns. Okay, mental health provision is a political issue. So as you say, it's that sort of word politics. So if you remove it, but also you can say, well, you shouldn't really have to remove it in the first place, because it shouldn't be this daunting word. Because actually, politics is relatively simple but I think it sits on a pedestal. But once you can get onto the pedestal, then a lot of the complexity collapses around you. You can see through it.
So with everything we've talked about today, what tactics do you think we will see over the next kind of running up to the next general elections? Will they be pretty much what we've seen already, or is there anything you can...
Propaganda always tries to flatter the voter. So the voters will not necessarily be asked to critically introspect upon their lives and their own contribution to certain things that may well be unhelpful towards them. So there's usually an element of flattery. You'll often see references to the royal family, which usually come out, in terms of allegiances to that. So, no one's actually going to do anything about the royal family. So it might be, you go to like the Labour Party or the Scottish National Party, and there's a sizable proportion of the members who want Britain to become a republic. Sizable proportion of the voters, usually hovers around 40 to 50%, but nothing will ever happen around that. So there's a distortion there between what the public expectation and what the politicians will actually do.
I think we'll still see the traditional kind of politicians kissing babies and visiting car factories and that sort of thing. But I think we'll see lots more kind of localised campaigns and candidates pushing their local credentials. And depending on how popular the party is within each constituency, they'll either be more aligned to the party or less aligned to the party, depending on that loyalty. So we've seen it in previous elections, and I think that will kind of carry on in future elections, particularly in the UK.
What trends are we likely to see over the next couple of years?
I think we'll still see like the trends like those kind of slogans that kind of get Brexit done, those kind of short, kind of sharp sound bites to try and appeal to people who aren't necessarily interested in politics and trying to get that kind of message out there. And again, these slogans, which are often criticised, they're kind of designed as a way to offer kind of instant differentiation with their competitors. And so I think we'll see a lot of that. And, you only have to look now between all the different parties that keep rolling out their latest sound bites or latest slogans. But but obviously they're all looking towards the next general election. It's what we're also looking at is that long-term campaigning now. It's not just like we kind of do it on a short-term thing. It's between now and the next election. It's kind of like a war footing, and everything is geared towards, obviously, election day. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think all those sound bites tend to lead to a sort of dumbing down of politics, though, because how much can you actually explain anything within sort of 20 to 30 seconds in something that's contained within a newsreel? So what you often find is the politician just says something very, very basic, or even something that doesn't make all that much sense in one form or another. So I think what we've seen in terms of the trends is a movement away from manifestos and the discussion of particular policies, and more into this realm of identity politics, where politicians appeal to voters based on how like them they are. And this leads to a kind of wider question in politics as to, well, do you want your politician to be just like you? Perhaps you want your politician to be more intelligent than you, and somebody who's actually not particularly relatable, but is a very good administrator and is can handle quite a large workload, can deal with the various struggles that there are to be a politician. And the idea that the question that's usually asked at election time is, in the last election, would you rather go for a pint with Boris Johnson or would you rather go for a pint with Jeremy Corbyn? And the vast majority of people would rather go for a pint with Boris Johnson, just for the what will happen on that evening. However, in terms of an actual running a functioning, dare I say it, integral regime, you'd probably say that Jeremy Corbyn is the person who would rather, knuckle down and do the job. However, what we end up with is a question, I say, around identity politics, not just the identity of the voter in terms of their nationality, their religious persuasion, their sexual orientation, their race, their gender, whatever, but also this idea of the relatability of the politician. And politicians are so anxious to be relatable. And actually, sometimes you have to question, well, as I say, do I actually want my politician to be just like me? Or do I want them to be somebody who is at a distance from me in some way?
And you can see why they're kind of like pushing the emotional side of the emotional connection with voters rather than the kind of rational approach. And that's why they kind of rely more on these quick sound bites, these kind of slogans that sometimes mean very little. You have to think back to the last election with the oven baked, ready Brexit deal. I can't remember the actual slogan, but you know what I mean. Or get Brexit done. Instantly recognisable kind of slogans, and people would latch onto that. But then if you ask voters, okay, what does that actually mean? They couldn't explain it. Same with, even politicians probably couldn't explain what it actually meant. But
and around Brexit, the Conservative Party kept on using the word dithering, so that if a Labour government came in, there would be dither. And it was interesting how they were trying to attach that to Jeremy Corbyn, because he was in his 60s, at least, and he was trying to say, well, that was actually a kind of quite a subtle, but quite a rather aggressive ageist comment that they were making about it. When actually there was not really any evidence that the Labour Party would have, in inverted commas, dithered any more than the Conservative Party had dithered between 2016 and 2019, or indeed even if that was part of the equation. So we see these just little subtle words that are used from time to time, which sometimes seem rather innocuous, but are actually quite malign in what they're trying to achieve.
And you've seen it this week in PMQs. Rishi Sunak is very much trying to remind voters that Keir Starmer was obviously within the shadow cabinet with Jeremy Corbyn, and he wants that kind of message, use that message right up until election day, I think, trying to make sure that voters don't forget that they were colleagues.
And you look at even Boris Johnson, and just before he left in the summertime, was trying to link Keir Starmer to Jimmy Savile as well when he was the director of public prosecutions. Again, that was a nasty little jab into him.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. I think we could obviously talk about this forever, but it's been really interesting, and thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about Chris and Colin's research, take a look at the episode description. You've been listening to the Research Reimagined podcast by Nottingham Trent University. For all of the latest news from the research community at NTU, follow us on Twitter at NTU_research or sign up to our research newsletter by visiting ntu.ac.uk/research. Thanks for listening.